For my next build lecture, I decided to do it on chapter 5 and kind of go into talking about the eukaryotic cells and microorganisms, just things that make them up and the different types of cells that you'll see in this and parts of them. So we'll jump right in with eukaryotic. So these cells have a nucleus, and some types of eukaryotic cells would be animal cells, plant cells, and fungi cells. So bacteria and archaea are our two major groups of eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells actually have nuclear membranes that encase the whole cell. Next, we'll talk a little bit about unicellular and multicellular. So when you look at these words, you'll look at the prefix uni and multi. So uni we know means one, and multi we know means many. So with unicellular, they're single-celled microorganisms with a defined nucleus, mitochondria, and other organelles. And with multicellular, these are organisms whose cells contain a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. So a little bit of difference there. These are some examples of unicellular and multicellular cells. So when you look at unicellular, you can think of plankton or phytoplankton, algae, protozoa, and even yeast. And then when you look at multicellular, you can kind of think of animal cells, plant cells, fungi cells, and protists. Next, we'll go into endosymbiosis. So they kind of say, they come up with this because they think a prokaryotic cell entered an ancestral eukaryotic cell. And with this theory, they kind of explain how the first chloroplast and mitochondria were made. We know that chloroplasts are the cells in plant cells that help them with photosynthesis. And we know that mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cells. And we'll actually go into mitochondria here in a little bit. So they say endosymbiosis is when one organism lives inside of another, but they're not always, it's not always a mutualistic relationship. So they're not happy with each other. It's not always a good relationship. So we're going to go over the different flagellar structures that bacteria, archaea, and eukaryote kind of use to get around. And they're all three different. Bacteria, they actually rotate independently, so they do their own thing. They're not kind of like archaea as to where they rotate as a single assembly. So in archaea, one does it, they're all doing it. They're in a single line. Bacteria, they kind of do what they want. And with the eukaryote cells, their flagella is actually found on the surface of the cell. And with this slide, I actually provided some pictures so you can see the different type of flagella on these cells. And you can see bacteria has multiple coming off the back end of the cell, and eukaryote has a couple coming off. And you can see with RK, there's all kinds around the cell. So like I said, these bacteria, they kind of move how they want, as you can see in the picture. They're all different ways. To where the eukaryote, they move hand in hand. If one does it, the other does it. So next we're going to kind of talk about the different components of a nucleus, and then we'll kind of jump into more detail on the next slides. So with a nucleus, you have the nuclear envelope, the nuclear lamina, the nucleolus, chromosomes, and nucleoplasm. So first we'll talk about that nuclear envelope. So what this does is it kind of separates the contents of the nucleus from the cytoplasm and provides the structural framework for the nucleus. So it kind of envelops that nucleus and keeps kind of the other stuff away. And then we have the nuclear lamina, which plays a critical role in maintaining nuclear shape, and it regulates gene expression through chromatin interaction. So we have the nuclear envelope that kind of keeps this stuff from mixing, keeps that cytoplasm out, and then the nuclear lamina that helps that nucleus keep its shape. Next we have the nucleolus, and this contains all the cell's chromosomes. And the nucleolus is actually a very important part of the cell. And that's because chromosomes are the parts of the cell that carry our long pieces of DNA. And chromosomes are the building block of the human body. So that's why the nucleolus is so important, because it contains those chromosomes, which contain all that genetic material. Next, we'll talk about that nucleoplasm, which is the central area of the cell that holds genetic material. So this is really important too. All that genetic material, that's the makeup for everything. Next, we're going to go over the transport process of proteins. So I'll go in more depth in the next slides, but this is just kind of a little overview. Okay, so anyway, sorry about that. We have the nucleus, and this will transport into that rough endoplasmic reticulum, which will then travel from the transport vesicles onto the Golgi apparatus up into the cell membrane, where then they will be released out. So with the transport process, ribosomes, and we'll go a little more into those in a little bit. They actually assemble these proteins before entering them into the rough ER. After that, the proteins are then moved through that rough ER where they are further modified. Next, those proteins are actually pinched off from the rough ER. And after that, the vesicles will fuse with the Golgi complex where they release the proteins inside of there. Once the proteins are in the Golgi complex, they are then processed and stored. The finished proteins are then pinched off from that Golgi complex, where the vesicles help those proteins travel to the cell membrane. Proteins will fuse with that, and then the proteins are released to the outside. So here we have some ribosomes, and ribosomes are connected with your rough endoplasmic reticulum and your smooth endoplasmic reticulum. So as you can see in the picture I provided, the little dots, the little black dots are actually your ribosomes. And ribosomes are actually found in all cells. They can either be free floating in the cytoplasm, or you'll see them kind of on the Golgi apparatus and the rough ER. Ribosomes actually link amino acids together, and they consist of small and large ribosomal units. You'll see those as like 70S and 80S. And here we have the mitochondria, which in my opinion is very important. And as you can see in the picture I provided, the pink and yellow structure kind of to the top of the pyramid, that is actually your mitochondria. And I'm sure you've heard before they call the mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell. And that's because the mitochondria is actually where energy production occurs. They use aerobic respiration to generate ATP, and ATP is actually energy. And the mitochondria is what powers the cell's biochemical reactions. So very important for the energy of that cell to be able to do the things that it needs to do. Next, we're going to talk about the 3 different cytoskeleton fibers. So we have microfilament, intermediate, and microtubule. So with the microfilament, this is where 2 intertwined strands of globular protein called actin, they form the microfilament. But you'll also hear microfilament called the actin filament, and that's why, because they're formed from actin. Intermediate, this actually organizes the internal structure of the cell. And then microtubule, they continue to assemble and disassemble things in the cell. Microtubule kind of is what its name says. They're kind of like little long tubes. So next we'll kind of talk about activities of fungi, whether it be detrimental or beneficial. They're kind of good and bad. So some detrimental activities of fungi is the spoiling of food. They can destroy timber, trees. They can actually cause disease in crops, livestock, and humans. But fungi is also beneficial because they decompose by breaking down plant and animal debris, and they also cycle nutrients and increase their availability in the soil. So you can love them, you can hate them, but they have good things that comes along with the bad things, obviously. And last, we'll talk about the different types of helminths. So you have roundworms and flatworms. Roundworms are actually called nematodes. They're usually found in the intestine of animals. And you treat your dogs for roundworms. It's part of their wormer. And these are parasitic. Roundworms, like I said, you worm your dog to get rid of roundworms or keep them from getting roundworms because they're not very good for your dogs. Flatworms are actually called platyhelminths. Um, they're found on surfaces and undersides of rocks and flowing water, and they're parasitic. And tapeworm is actually part of this, which we know is not good for you. A tapeworm can kill you. So, helminths are worms, and I know for one, I don't like worms.